Welcome.
Hello.
Shalom.
Okay, let's get started.
Lots of people wonder what Yah's covenant has to do with a tree, his covenant calendar. Well, it has a lot to do with the tree because of timelines. So this is part 3 in this series of 3 for Daniel 4. And I've called it the sneaky switches and glitches, or sneaky switches and patterns of Daniel. So not too many slides here today. I think there's about 44 teaching slides, not too many. But just a little bit of a review of Daniel 4 part 2. Just to get started. We were talking about interpretation and application in part 2, and that was kind of a little bit of a, maybe a tricky one for a lot of people, is that the king needed to have an interpretation because he didn't understand what was going on. Daniel knew what this vision was all about. He just was going to give the application. He knew about similes and metaphors. He knew that when he heard this dream, this vision from the king, he knew that, the king's in trouble. So as far as Daniel's viewpoint was concerned, he didn't need an interpretation from the angel Gabriel or from a vision, a heavenly vision or anything. He already knew what was going on. But the king, he definitely wanted an interpretation. And you can remember he couldn't get it from the Chaldeans. They didn't know what to do. But Daniel was just going to relate the prophecies from Ezekiel. Same thing as those leaders from Egypt and Assyria. They were leaders that were called trees, and they were cut down and they were never brought into their position. So again, Daniel just gave King Nebuchadnezzar the application of what was going to happen. So we learned about that in part 2. We also learned about timelines in prophecy. Any timeline in a prophecy is prophetic time. Doesn't matter, it's prophetic time no matter what. But we learned that if there were symbols in the vision, that the timeline was then going to be prophetic symbolic time. And if there wasn't any symbols, if it's just literal language, then the timeline is just plain old literal time. And we also learned that there is some literal language that has a prophetic sound to it, like time, times and a half a time. And that's just another way of Daniel saying this is a number, words for the number 1,260. And when we have that kind of wording and it's in a symbolic vision, then we have to apply a year for a day calculation principle there so that we can understand how long the timeline is. So we went through some of that prophetic timelines and prophetic terminology. Another thing that we learned is that Yahuwah does not repeat things of no great consequence. When he repeats things more than 2 times, it's time to listen up, even if it's only 2 times. And what we found in Daniel 4 is that the 7-year timeline is there 4 times. No other vision in Daniel does this, only in Daniel chapter 4, because he has something very special to show to us. And we found out that having that 7-year timeline up in the heavenly scene was the very spot that would give us the clues that this was definitely a literal vision. So we're just going to go over our Isaiah 46, 9, and 10 because this does declare the end from the beginning. Say it with me. Remember the former things of old, for I am Yahuwah, and there is none else, declaring the end from the beginning. And he declares from the ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all of my pleasure. And that's the really neat thing about Daniel's book, is that the very end chapter, the very last chapter, is declaring something at the very end of time that he already figured out at the beginning. So when we get to the end of the chapter, and I don't have time to do a whole Daniel study, but it's the epilogue. It's what happens at the very end of time. So for some to say that the Daniel 12 timelines actually belong back in the Dark Ages, that is not the end of time. That is not when things are finished. That hasn't got a thing to do with the very end of time. So we would naturally want to have the end time events at the end of the book, and that's exactly what Daniel does. But you know what? There are some theologians out there that don't like that. They want to have those Daniel 12 timelines way back in the dark ages. They don't want to have them in the future because they have a couple of rules of their own. So I'm calling this little section here the theologians' sneaky switch. And there is something to consider here. It's very interesting what we find in Daniel. What we find in Daniel is his visions are either symbolic or literal. You do not find in Daniel's book, there's 5 visions. One in chapter 4 is for the king only, but the other 4 are for Yah's people. They're either completely symbolic or they're literal. He does not mix the two, not ever, not ever. But I did show you some examples where John does mix the two. And when you have symbolic visions and you've got timelines, that then you have to look at something else. Another rule, it's context is king. When the context of the passage moves your events forward, and then you have a timeline like the 42 literal months, there is no more time for 1,260 years at the end of time. So John does a few things a little bit different. That's why he wants you to know what's happening in Daniel. And we're going to have another slide about that in a little bit. So the theologians' sneaky switch. Well, some of them say this. The vision of Daniel 4 is symbolic, but the 7-year timelines are literal. This is what has happened to me. The theologians of my denomination say that Daniel 4 is symbolic. They say the tree is symbolic, but they say that the 7-year timelines are literal. And you already know that there's something wrong with this, okay? You've already learned that. So let's make a correction here. There are no symbols in Daniel chapter 4. We've spent 2 whole sessions going over that. There are no symbols whatsoever. There are no prophetic symbolic timelines. And don't ever forget that Daniel keeps his book really, really simple. He keeps it simple so you can understand what's going on. And what we have found so far is that everything about the vision in chapter 4 is absolutely literal. We even looked at what a symbolic tree might look at to compare it to a real tree. So just remember this. Daniel never ever mixes symbolism with literal timelines. He doesn't do that and then expect for you to figure out what's what. But like I said before, John the Revelator, he does mix symbolism in with some of his visions, and he's got timelines there that are literal timelines. 1 day equals 1 day, and that's because context is king. John will also mix symbolic and literal language together in the same vision and even in the same chapter. Some of his visions take more than 1 chapter, but he'll mix things up, and you have to watch for that. And he'll have similes and metaphors in there. You need to watch for that kind of thing. That's why it is so important to understand the ground rules that are given by Daniel before trying to give a proper application to timelines. And most of them are in Revelation, the ones that we're talking about prophecy. But there's other timelines as well. There's timelines in the Gospels. So we're trying to get this groundwork covered so that you'll know how to work with timelines in the Gospels. That's what this is all about. We're trying to get to that gospel study. So what does John the Revelator expect of you? He just requires you to have a very good understanding of the hermeneutic principles or the prophetic rules as taught by Daniel. Daniel's just using, very basic concepts, like your kind of your entry, school entry level. John's going to be at the university level. So just learn it in Daniel and then make the applications in Revelation. And I have not had time to do that. But if you mix these two, it is deadly. And there are consequences when you mix in Daniel symbolic visions and literal timelines. It is error, absolute error for anyone to take Daniel 4 and mix symbolism with his literal timelines. It just doesn't work. And remember, we said that the king would be in the field till about 1953 to get through his 2,520 years. And what is the consequence? Deadly mixture totally destroys the structure of Daniel's book. And nobody has permission, not even from Daniel, to touch his structure. Now, I haven't really had a chance to show you. I've only shown you a little bit of the structure, but there's so much structure to Daniel. It's his blueprint of how he put his book together, and he's got it put together so tight. He followed that blueprint pattern so perfectly that when you follow his structure and you find it and you follow it, you will know that the Daniel 12 timelines cannot be put anywhere else but in the future. There's no way that they can go into the past. He's already given all the timelines for the past. But there are still many leaders and theologians that say, oh, no, no, we're the ones that have the PhDs, and we're the ones that are teaching you, and we're the ones that have the time to study our Bibles, and that tree in Daniel 4, it's definitely a symbolic tree. Oh, but then they'll say the timeline is only 7 years, 7 literal years. And there are some people, too, that are on another study. It's called the 2520. They will link this chapter 4 using the 4 different times that this timeline comes up as 2520. Trying to remember if they connect it to Leviticus 16. There's a specific chapter in Leviticus that also talks about 7 times, and they've got another whole doctrine built on that. But you know what? It's not 2,520 years. It's 2,520 days, which equals 7 years. So lots of leaders and theologians will try to lord it over us and press us down like we don't know what's going on and we can't figure it out. Well, they're 50% right when they say that the timeline is only 7 years. But there is a problem. There absolutely is a problem when they say that the tree in Daniel 4 is symbolic. So if I have to say it another couple times, I will. Daniel teaches that that tree is a literal tree, and that timeline is literal time, and that's it, 100%. There's no deviation at all. And we already have found out that that makes a whole lot more sense, and Nebuchadnezzar was only in the field for 7 years. We're going to go through that step by step at the end of this session today and just find out how this really works. And I'm pretty sure he was happy to be released. So why in the world would this sneaky switch be used? I'm calling it a sneaky switch. I don't know what else to call it. I don't know. It's just sneaky. It really is, because a lot of people cannot figure out what in the world is going on. They don't know the structure of Daniel. They have no arguments. They have no foundation. They don't know how to debate this or how to throw it back in their lap and say, you can't do that. So this is the way it works, this sneaky switch. If people can be convinced to practice this switch in Daniel 4, then when studying the fourth vision, there's no trouble. The fourth vision is Daniel 10, 11, and 12. Those chapters, that's the fourth vision. Then when they're studying Daniel 10 and 11 and 12, there is no trouble to convince the people to accept the Daniel 12 timelines as symbolic time, even though they are written in a vision using only literal language and literal timelines. I'm going to explain this. Daniel chapter 10 is just basically a little prelude to his vision that he's going to get. He was praying. Michael comes along, gives him some instruction. And then in chapter 11 is the actual heavenly scene. That's the vision. And it's basically 45 verses long. It's a very long chapter. And it's about the kings of the north and the kings of the south, and he's and hims and theys and thous. There's all kinds of them. But all the way through, it's kings of the north and kings of the south. And by the way, that is not symbolic language. That is a title. It's title of literal kings. Some were in the north in Syria, And the kings of the south were usually down there in Egypt. And who are they fighting over? They're fighting over the territory in between, which happens to be Israel. Everybody wants it. Eventually, the king of the north wins out, and the king of the north actually ends up being passed over to Rome. Rome ends up being the king of the north. Right there around Daniel 11:35, something like that. It's a really interesting chapter. Never really heard anybody give a sermon on it. But one thing you need to remember about these 45 verses is the forward progressive movement. All of your time has to go forward in time. So if you get to the point in Daniel chapter 11, where it's basically talking about the birth of Yahusha, you'll see where it is about the raiser of the taxes and whatnot, then you know you're at that point in time. That means that the next verses that come after that don't go backwards in time is very important principle. Okay, so when you get to the end of Daniel 11, you come into Daniel 12 and there's still 13 more verses. Daniel 11 finishes with the very last king of the north, the very last one. It's a Roman king of the north. You're at the very end of time because it says he's going to be finished, and that's going to be it, broken without hand, and a few other things. Then you have 13 more verses in Daniel 12 that have 3 more timelines. When you have the last king of the north already at the end of time, there is no more time for 1,260 years or 1,290 years or even 1,335 years. There is no more time. Logically, anybody reading it, a child, would understand there is no more time. Very interesting how theologians can convince congregations that you get to the last 13 verses. Daniel 11:45 was at the very last king of the north, but somehow you get to the last few verses from 7 to 12, and all of a sudden we went back in time. We didn't go to forward progressive movement, we went backwards. Daniel does not allow that in his book. It's just not there. Well, what else does this sneaky switch do? Listen, this technique must convince the people that every single timeline in prophecy must always be converted with the day for a year computation principle unless the authorities say otherwise. So if they want to switch it, this has happened to me many times. They just say, you know what? It doesn't work that way. We say it doesn't work that way. Yeah, we hear that you said that Daniel, last king of the north, is at the very end of time, but we're saying the timelines in Daniel 12 are prophetic, symbolic times, so they have to go back in the dark ages. Well, Daniel doesn't give any permission. And if I could have a chance to show you how this works, with the full structure chart, I think you would just love it. But that's not our mandate for today. We're not doing that today. Okay, so here we are. We have Daniel's interpreting the tree just as literal, but here, if we have a symbolic tree, all right, if we have a symbolic tree, then you can switch the timeline to symbolic language. But they don't. They say, oh no, it's a symbolic tree, but it's just literal language. They do a switch there. And who's going to know the difference? Who's going to correct them and let them know that, no, they're wrong? None of us, not very many of us know what to do. And then they go ahead and they do the switch there in chapter 11, where they interpret Daniel's kings as literal kings. They know that. They sort of know that is just a title. They're literal kings. But what do they go ahead and do next? They switch all of the timelines in that very same vision. It's not a new vision. The timelines that are at the end of vision 4 are the 1260, 1290, and the 1335. Now the 1260 says a times and a dividing of time, something like that. And then the 1290, it actually says 1,290 days. And 1335, it says 1,335 days. It actually says that. But they say, no, that's symbolic time. It doesn't work. But most people don't know what to say to make it work. So Daniel's structure, that's why I say if you can understand that, go through it and find it and comb through it, it's not that hard. It will answer a lot of questions. Think about this for a moment. If the theological authorities are saying something different than what Daniel is showing in his work, then all of us have a decision to make. And the decision that we need to make is who has the final authority. Is it Pastor so-and-so? Is it Rabbi so-and-so? Or, is it the favorite television evangelist? Or is it the scriptures? Is it the original prophet that actually wrote down the information? Is he the one that has the final authority? That's who we have to say. We need to go back to them and say, do you really think you have the final authority to say where those timelines belong? Because they really believe it and they're teaching it. The year-day principle is not used in some prophecies, and they are timeline prophecies. I want to show you something, because the theologians will actually pick and choose where they want to use this rule. They're not consistent. So here is a prophecy. It's Noah's prophecy, and it's talking about that the world would be flooded in 120 years. It's right there in Genesis 6. Nobody says that's year for a day. You just calculate that out. That is, they say, oh, that prophecy, that's okay. That's just 120 years. And by the way, I was taught that this was 120 years of Noah building the ark. That isn't so either. This is talking about 120 Jubilee years. Why? Because Noah was 500, and just a verse or two later, it talks about the 120, and when he entered the ark, he was 600 years old. So that's only 100 years at the most. So what did they do with this? It's a timeline prophecy. Nobody ever says you have to use the year-day principle on that one. What about Abraham's prophecy? That his people would be enslaved by Egypt. Now there's two ways. It mentions it either 400 years or 430. There's two ways to calculate that, okay? But nobody takes those 400 years, calculates all the number of days in those 400 years. I think it comes out to 144,000. If you do 400 times 360, I think that's what it comes out to. I'm just going to give my calculator to Richard, and he's gonna do it right now. But 400 times 360 days in a year. Nobody ever says, well, you have to do the year-day computation principle on that one. And yes, it does come out to 144,000. So that would be 144,000 years. They don't say anything about that. What about Elijah's prophecy, where he said there wasn't going to be any rain for 3.5 years? Nobody says that you have to calculate that out to be 1,260 years or whatever. They don't say anything about that. They just conveniently leave it out. So when you're looking at these kinds of things and you're being questioned by teachers that think they have some authority, and they do have authority on some things, your question should be to them, look, why isn't the year for a day principle used on all of the time prophecies? What about Noah and Abraham and Elijah? What we'd like you to do is start asking these questions. Find out what they have for an answer, if they do indeed have an answer. There's lots of consequences for this sneaky switch. It doesn't stop there. We'll just look at a few other things that might be coming along. This is what happens when you force the prophetic rule of year for a day. That prophetic rule, 1 year equals 1 day in prophecy, and you put it into a prophetic literal timeline, it will always give you the incorrect interpretation of the timeline. It will never, ever be correct. It will always be wrong if you use the wrong rule where it doesn't belong. And that is very, very serious. And that is exactly what's happening with the Daniel 12 timelines. The very timelines that are so special for Yah's people at the very end of time, to know exactly how many steps, how many days they have to walk to get through this very serious time of tribulation and trouble, that it's just a short time. You can hang in there. They take that away from you. They take away all the hope and the joy. They take away everything, and they instill fear. They instill fear, because if you don't know how long those timelines are at the end of time, you're just going to think that they're never going to end. It instills a lot of fear. It's a doctrine of fear. Well, what's going to be the result when you allow the theologians to do this? The Daniel 12 timelines will never, ever be given the correct application. It just won't happen. You won't have any meaning. You won't understand them. You won't study them. You'll stay away from it. You won't, in fact, they'll convince you. You don't even know how to study this out. These timelines are very important. But one thing, Daniel was told to close the book. He was not given the information on these timelines. He was passing the baton to John the Revelator, because John is the one that opens up the understanding of these timelines. Daniel was told to close the words in the book. Well, how can we avoid this sneaky switch? Maybe you already know this by now. The very first thing you have to do is determine if the vision is written with symbols in it, or is it just plain literal language? Daniel 2 with that image, there was symbolism there a lot. Daniel 7 with the beasts and its horns, those are all symbols. Daniel 8, that's a little bit different. It had regular sanctuary sacrificial animals, but the horns were different. It's all about different kinds of horns. The horns were symbolic. Then in the last vision of Daniel, 10, 11, and 12, it's all literal language. Kings of the north and kings of the south. So first of all, you need to determine if the vision is symbolic, if there's symbols in it, or if it's just literal language. So that's what you want to do when you go into Revelation. Second, if you're not really sure if the language of the vision is symbolic or just plain literal, then you need to look at similes and metaphors. Is there language that says it's like this, or it's as this, or it's comparing one to another? Revelation 9 has a lot of those simile and metaphor comparisons. Then you need to go and check out those kinds of English grammar lessons. And the end result of all that will be that Daniel's rules will not be changed. And you will have a correct understanding of all of the timelines. You need to study some of them out with history, but you'll understand where the timelines belong. Now, this is on the historical level of application, the first level of application in Daniel's book. There are many people that are taking Daniel's book, using the patterns that are there, and moving the interpretation into the end times. But then those timelines also have to be moved into a literal application in the end time. And basically, the same rules apply in Revelation. So what Daniel is trying to let everybody know, learn the rules in his book where they're easy, and then make the applications into Revelation. But there's also timelines in other areas as well that have these same applications. Daniel's just kind of got them all put into his book in one nice little bundle. Okay, so that's the sneaky switch. We're not going to get caught with the theologians, and if you hear anybody saying, you know what, those timelines are in the past, in the dark ages, you can go, I don't think he's right about that. You might not know all the right answers, but you'll know where to find them. Okay, so let's look at the last section. There was 7 to understand Daniel 4. There's 7 sections. This is the last one, and I think it's the most fun. It's how in the world do we know how to begin a timeline and how to end a timeline? Well, there's just a really easy rule. Listen to this, and it might sound a little bit strange if you've never heard it before. It says, all timelines must begin and end with a speaking voice or a decree, and that can be from Yahuwah, It can be from man. It can be from a legislative assembly. There has to be something that starts the timeline, and then the timeline runs its full course. And then there has to be a voice or a decree that ends the timeline so that you know that it's ending, that it just didn't get lopped off in the middle somewhere. There's a lot of people that are looking at prophecy. They take the 70-week timeline. They have it in the past. Rome is just great at this, Rome with their rules. And they lop off the last 7 years, and they say the last 7 years of that 70 years, that doesn't belong there. It belongs in the future. That's a whole nother study about what they're doing and how they're violating Daniel's laws in his book, his rules, his prophetic rules. But they do that. And this Left Behind series, this 7 years of tribulation, and Yah's people are going to be raptured out and they're not going to be here. That's all from lopping off a timeline, chopping it up into two pieces. They have most of it 2,000 years ago, and then the other 7 years is way down at the end of time. There is no permission for that in Daniel whatsoever. So you find a timeline. How does it start? And then it runs the full course, and then it has to end. So let's look at this, because this is where Daniel shines. How to begin and end prophetic timelines. It's really exciting. We're just going to go over the 3 prophetic keys. We've done them before, but let's just do a review. These are in the Daniel book. This is key number 22. Timelines are never shortened or severed. Never. Because if they are shortened without you knowing about it, then you can't trust those timelines one little bit. Yahuwah gave you those timelines so you could count out the days and you know when they start and when they end. There can be persecution within the timelines and tribulation that is very severe. And Yahuwah can cut the tribulation short, and he does, so that the very elect would be saved. But the timeline must run. So we need to remember that just because there's tribulation and it gets cut short, and thankfully he does cut it short, but the timeline has to finish out. Otherwise, you can't trust the timeline. And then you have another problem, because they become idle words in Scripture, and you don't know whether to trust them or not. But thankfully, Yah does not change, and he does not lie, and he cannot lie. Key number 26. All timelines must have a beginning and an ending with a voice or a decree. And like I said, it can be from Yahuwah or man or a legislative assembly. We have to learn to watch and listen for these voices. And here's one I haven't talked about. Key number 27. All timelines basically have good news and not so good news for both groups of people, either for Yah's people or for those that are not for him, those that are against him. I'm not really going to go into this too much, but as you study timelines, you're going to see that there's good news for some and there's some not so good news for others. And remember, when the handwriting was on the wall, it's not really a timeline there, but Belshazzar, King Belshazzar, couldn't read it. Remember, he called Daniel in to read it. He wanted to know what this mystic letters were on his wall. Well, it was good news for Yah's people, because they were going to come out of the bondage of Babylon. But it was not such good news for the king, because that night he was weighed in the balances and found wanting. So as you work with timelines, look for the good news and look for the bad news. So what I want you to do is, as we go through these verses in Daniel chapter 4 with King Nebuchadnezzar, I want you to look for the good news and the bad news, okay? I might forget to say it. So let's go through Daniel 4 verse by verse, the verses that we need. And we're going to be starting in the heavenly scene portion, the very first component of the structure, where Nebuchadnezzar is actually relaying the vision. And there's a timeline there. Okay, we're just kind of going to pick out the verses so you can see what's happening. And he's saying to Daniel, let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. And then in verse 17, look what it says. This matter is by the decree of the watchers. A decree. There is your decree, okay? And then when we go to the outline portion of the vision, that's where we have the literal interpretation. Daniel is now going to confirm back to Nebuchadnezzar that this is a 7-year timeline. In verse 16, in the heavenly scene, it said 7 times, okay? In verse 23, Daniel is saying, let the king's portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. Daniel is telling him, this is the interpretation. There's going to be 7 times. The 7-year timeline is going to begin with a decree. As we continue looking in our outline, the prophecy is explained. In verse 24, here's what Daniel said. This is the interpretation you want, King Nebuchadnezzar. Although remember, Daniel was only applying. He's only making an application from the prophecies of Ezekiel. But he's saying, this is the interpretation, O king. And now listen. And this is the decree of who? The Most High. Here is the speaking voice of the Most High. This is the decree. And then he confirms this 7-year timeline. In the next part of the structure, everything's moving forward, and we're getting to the answer to the interlude question. And the question is, what is the interpretation of this dream? And here Daniel gives the answers to the king. 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. And remember in verse 24, the verse before it, he said this is a decree of the Most High Elohim. Well, remember Daniel had to wait for an hour before he told the king the news, because it was kind of bad news, wasn't it? But it wasn't the very next hour or the very next day that this all happened. There was a probationary time. Yahuwah was so kind and merciful to King Nebuchadnezzar, he gave him a probation time to think it over and just figure out what he was doing. Remember, he said, is it not I that built Babylon? He had forgotten who had helped him. Well, in verse 29, it tells us a little secret. It says, at the end of 12 months, he, the king, walked in his palace. Now, when it says at the end of 12 months, do you think that that's 11 and a half months? Or, the beginning of the 12th month? Or what? Or is that the end of the 12th month? Do you think this was a 360-day prophecy? Anyway, it says at the end of 12 months. This is calendar language. And this is where the probationary time is going to end. Guess what? Along comes this speaking voice. Whose voice is it? In verse 30, the very next verse, it says, the king spake, is this not great Babylon that I built by my power for my majesty? And the very next phrase in the next verse says, while the word was in the king's mouth. Guess what, everybody? At that very instant, at that very time that the word was in the king's mouth, guess who speaks next? Yahuwah of heaven begins to speak. And this is where this 7-year timeline is enacted. Now, this is coming up to the end time event in that structure. I hope you remember it. And this is where our prophecy for this timeline is going to begin to have its fulfillment. And the next part of verse 31, the second part says, there fell a voice from heaven. Remember that decree back there in verse 24? It was from the Most High. There fell a voice from heaven saying, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. Right now, right at this point, I have given you 12 months probationary time to think this over and to change your mind, but you haven't. You're still speaking haughty. So right now, while the word is in your mouth, this is where the timeline begins. Right there in verse 31. And Yah continues and he says, thy dwelling shall be with the beasts. And what? 7 times are going to pass over you. You're going to be out there for 7 years, just like Daniel said. It's goosebumpy, isn't it? It's just like so neat. And so the 7-year timeline begins exactly on time. You know what? Biblical timelines are trustworthy. You can trust them, but you need to know how to work with them so you can have fun with them and you can know what's going on. Then it goes on to say in verse 33, the same hour, remember, that's at the end of the 12 months that was listed back there in verse 29. It says the same hour was the thing. What's the thing? It's that prophetic vision. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men. That was it. It all happened so quickly. Well, he was out there for 7 years. We're going to find out about it because it's Nebuchadnezzar's voice that ends the prophetic 7-year timeline. It says in verse 34, and at the end of the days, this is the end of the 7-year timeline, King Nebuchadnezzar says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, I lifted up my eyes, and my understanding returned unto me. And look what he says, I blessed and I praised with his speaking voice, with his mouth and his tongue. He said, I blessed and I praised and I honored him that liveth forever and ever. It was his speaking voice when he honored the creator of the heavens and gave him the glory. That's where he ended the 7-year timeline. And then Nebuchadnezzar was ready to be restored to his kingdom. And look what it says in verse 36. At the same time, my reason returned unto me, and I was established in my kingdom. That was at the end of the 7-year timeline. Remember, the tree was cut down. There was a band of iron and brass that was bound around the stump to keep it moist. And that was a promise to Nebuchadnezzar that was going to sprout again and that he would be put back on his throne. And that's exactly the way it happened. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar, he received a very stern warning. It was stern. In verses 16 and 17, the king told Daniel that he was shown by divine decree that his life would be involved with a 7-year timeline. In verses 23, 24, and 25, moving forward, Daniel confirms the application, but he adds a warning of probation. Daniel knew what was going to happen. He didn't want this to happen to the king, but it was a prophecy. And moving forward into verse 29, we have the information that the probation of the king lasted to the end of 12 months. He had 12 months to change his mind. If he would have changed his mind and given glory to Yah, the 7-year timeline of being in the field would have been removed. That would have been the consequence for obedience. So I just want to show you a little tiny table about voices that begin and end the 7-year timeline in Daniel 4. And there's little timeline tables like this for, I think there's 7 of them in the Daniel book, and this is the very first one because this is the first chapter that has a timeline. So the way it's set up is it's timeline number 1, and it says it's 7 times or 7 literal years. The subject of the timeline, it's all about King Nebuchadnezzar and his pride, okay? In the third little block of the table, it tells you the scriptures that you're looking at for the prophetic timeline. In Daniel 4, it's verses 16, 23, 25, and 32, taking up 4 different components in that structure. And I probably should arrange this a little bit different, but just watch, okay? The speaking voice, or the decree, it's a heavenly voice, and it begins the king's probation. That's there in Daniel 4, 29 and 31. Once that speaking voice starts this decree, then what happens next, we all read it, is that the timeline begins, and that is where the king is driven to the field as a wild beast in verses 31 to 33. It said, while the word was still in his mouth. And he's there for 7 years until what? We read it. Until there's another speaking voice, another decree. It's a decree from the king's voice himself, where he praises Yah and gives him all the glory and the honor. And at that point, it said in that very hour, that is when the timeline ends. He has a deliverance from his insanity after 7 years, and he's restored to his throne. It's just that simple. Daniel lays it all out in Daniel chapter 4. Really a fun chapter, and most people think it's just a chapter that the king has to be humbled. Well, that did happen, but there was a whole lot more that was going on in that chapter. Daniel was wanting to teach us how to work with timelines. Very, very interesting that he puts it there before another prophetic timeline around God's people, Yah's people, in Daniel chapter 7. So what does this mean for Daniel 12? Where these 3 timelines are in Daniel 12? Well, means a couple of things. And I want you to remember that we're not just talking about Daniel 12 today. I want you to apply these principles to timelines in Revelation, and also the same principles to any other timeline, and especially in the Gospels. But in Daniel's book, he does not give any dates for these timelines. There's no dates in history that go around these timelines as of yet, okay? Not for the future, all right? In fact, Daniel doesn't give you any hints for the voices that begin and end these timelines. It's not in Daniel 12. There's not very many verses there. You can read it. But we all know that when the 1290-day timeline ends, that everything's going to be finished. Now, if you look in Daniel chapter 12, you'll see the words like the end and it shall be finished, those kinds of terms. There are 7 terms there in those 13 verses that when you do the search through the word number, the Hebrew definitions, every one of them is talking about the very border edge of time. Not one of them are talking about time in the last 2,000 years. Everything's about the border edge of time. The clues for the beginning and the ending voices of these timelines, these 3 wonderful timelines, are only found in Revelation. Don't ask me. We're not doing that part of the study. But John is the one that's going to break open what you have to listen to. He's going to tell you what are the voices and decrees. Then we need to listen to our world events. What are these decrees that'll probably come down from legislative assemblies and whatnot? And when those decrees are enacted, then the timeline will come into its fruition to begin. So John tells us the event that's going to begin and end the timelines. And like I said, it's up to us to listen. We need to be paying attention and listening. Who is speaking that would start these timelines? And then we often know that it connects to events, and we can have a date at that point in time. Before that, we have no date. So nobody's setting any dates. This is homework for us. This is homework for Yah's last day people, okay? His bride, his 144,000. And all those that are working with the 144,000. They're going to have lots of helpers. So, do you trust Daniel to handle all these theological challenges? Do you really trust Daniel to be able to answer these questions? And I'm here to share with you that if there is any theological authority that wishes to argue and convince you that your understanding of timeline interpretation is mistaken, this is all you have to do. Just ask them to go and accept Daniel's challenge and confirm their understanding from Daniel's book alone. Tell them, wait a second, that's coming from you. I want you to prove what you're saying to me. Let's just use Daniel 12 as an example. I want you to prove that the Daniel 12 timelines belong in the dark ages from Daniel's book, from Daniel's structure, from Daniel's blueprint. You prove it to me from Daniel's work. And guess what, everyone? They won't be able to do it. Because you're going to know the structure. You're going to know how this works. You're going to know what Daniel's rules are, and you're going to know what Daniel chapter 4 is really teaching. Because I haven't met one pastor that understands this. In fact, I was sharing this with a pastor in 2005, and he invited me to come to Williams Lake and to share it with the members of his church. I just about dropped over. The book wasn't published yet, but I had broken this piece open. And so I went in, and a 3.5-hour drive to travel in. And I shared this, and Pastor Hosking was his name. He's not alive anymore. But he said to me, he said, Charlene, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. It was about 35 people there that night from his congregation in a nice home. And he said, can you come back tomorrow night? He says, was it tomorrow night or the next week, whatever it was. He said, please come back. He said, I want you to give this again. I said, well, okay, I can come back. So I went back, and it was kind of a different group. There was different people there, and we were in a new home. It was a very small home with a wood stove. It was very warm. It was in the winter time. And this is what he said to his members. He said, everyone, I want you to pay attention to what is going to be given to you here tonight about Daniel 4. Because he said, you'll never hear anything like it ever again. He said, I've never heard anything like this. And you need to pay attention to what's going on to this chapter. And I thought, wow, that's wonderful. But there was no fruit that came out of it. Not that I know of, not yet. But people didn't have anything to say because Daniel had the last word. You know, it's really a good idea to keep things in mind that it is a serious violation when we tamper with Daniel's structure and we don't have his permission to do so, and we change things around in his structure. That is a violation. It's a violation when we change his rules on how to work with timelines. And that's not just timelines in the book of Daniel. That's timelines everywhere in Scripture. In Revelation, it's all of them. Daniel is the one that had set it down so everybody could understand. Now, the interesting thing is that the Jews, you know, as they became more corrupt after they came back from Babylon, they put a curse on the Daniel 9 timelines. And they put a curse on people that wanted to study those timelines. So they removed those beautiful timelines that actually point to the Messiah. And, you know, one of those, the keys of understanding, that's from Luke, what is it, 11:52. They took away those keys of understanding and put fear over the people. Not that the people had, all of them had copies of the Scriptures, but they didn't teach them. And they put a curse on them for trying to understand those timelines and study them. So those people, that they had nothing. They had no way to pinpoint the Messiah. If those leaders would have followed the Daniel timeline instructions that he gives in chapter 4, they could have broken open those timelines for the people very easily, and all of them over those 490 years of waiting would have known how to pinpoint the Messiah. But the Messiah arrived, and they didn't really know if it was him. They all said, could it be? Could it be? Even his disciples said, could it be? The leaders, the corrupt leaders, violated Daniel. They took away the keys. What a shame. It's just incredible. But it's still happening today. It's still happening today. And no matter what others may say, I don't care who it is, timelines will always follow the guidelines as they are given in Daniel. I don't care who it is. They've got to go back to Daniel. Well, it also includes very, very special timeline that was spoken by Yahusha himself, where he said that he would be, as it was a sign. They asked, what is the sign that's going to prove that you're really the Messiah? Remember, he said 3 days and 3 nights. He didn't say close to or maybe. He didn't say you can use inclusive reckoning. He didn't say, well, you can shorten it to however you want. These principles hold true for the gospel study. That's where we're going with calendar, is into the gospels. That's why we're doing Daniel 4, so we can understand this timeline. It is so important. Lots of reasons. But one of the main reasons is that a lot of them, theologians, a lot of teachers of prophecy, they use this inclusive reckoning, where they say, well, a part of a day counts as a whole day, whether it was just an hour or just 5 minutes. No, that's not how timelines work. Not prophetic timelines, and definitely not a prophetic timeline about the Messiah, the most important being in the whole universe and the most important timeline in the whole universe. It does not get shortened, and it does not get lengthened. It's 3 days and 3 nights. 72 hours, and that's it. No more and no less. Because if the timeline is lengthened or if it's shortened, guess what? You might have the wrong Messiah. And that's exactly what happens with the Friday crucifixion, where they use a few hours on a Friday to count as a whole day. They say he was in the grave all day Sabbath, sleeping, resting. Well, they got 24 hours there. And then he rose Sunday morning. Barely the sun had risen and he was gone. Well, that was the third day. It doesn't work. And the reason is that you can go back to Daniel and say it doesn't work because Daniel laid down the rules. You need 3 days and 3 nights. And there isn't 3 nights with a Friday cross and a Sunday resurrection. There isn't a Sunday resurrection anyway. Okay? So the Daniel and Revelation timelines are important and they're lots of fun. They have a different purpose. They tell us where we are in the stream of prophetic time so that we know where we're walking, so that we know how long it is until we get to the end. Because it can be weary. It's probably going to be very weary. But the gospel timeline, that's different. That points to the true Messiah. That's the true Messiah. We're going to break that one open when we get to the Gospels. And there's going to be some surprises because there are other timelines there that are about 3 days and 3 nights. And we're going to break open Revelation 11 that talks about a 3.5 day timeline. We're going to show you how it all works together. And it's goosebumpy. It's wonderful. But you know what? It's all pointing to the Messiah. It points to his first fruits, those 2 witnesses, and they are going to walk in his steps. It's going to be really exciting. Well, let's just do a little review. We're coming to the end. Let's remember that chapter 4 gives very clear explanation that every prophetic timeline has to have some kind of a speaking voice and a decree. This isn't a witchy voice. These are voices that Yah has put in place for us to recognize when a timeline is going to begin and when it's going to end. We need to stay tuned. We need to have our ears open. And let's never forget that timelines are exact. They're going to begin exactly on time. Yahuwah has it from the end to the beginning. He had this all figured out before he even created this earth. They're going to end exactly on time. They're going to, once they start, they're going to begin and they're going to run the full length until they end. And Yahuwah said it would be that way so that you could trust him. When he gives you a timeline, you can trust it right to the very last day. And they are never severed. That's how you're going to do away with this whole left behind, all that stuff, the 7 years being left behind, people getting raptured out. They're not going to go through the tribulation. I've got news for them. Daniel doesn't teach that either. He's teaching that when you're doing his work and there's a tribulation, he's going to be there and walk through it with you. And even if he has to be in the fiery furnace with you or in the lion's den, he's going to walk through that tribulation with you. He's not shortening any timelines. You better know the answer to this question. Is Daniel 4 symbolic vision or literal vision? You better say it's a literal vision. And I hope that you understand why, because that's what this has been all about. There is no symbolism here at all. We're just going to conclude this right now. Timelines are hot topics. Trust me, they are very hot topics, but they do not have to be hot potatoes. You can know what to do with timelines. Daniel 4, he sets the precedent of what he expects you to do with every timeline, especially the epilogue timelines that are in Daniel 12, the most important timelines of the whole book, because they're for us. They are the ones that are for us. And he hands it all over to John the Revelator, who's going to give every detail that you need to know about those timelines and how to get through. If Daniel 4 is misunderstood, chances are that many of the timelines in Daniel and Revelation are also going to be misunderstood. You just will not know how to break them open. Daniel tells us very, very simply how to identify between symbols and similes and metaphors. When you're trying to determine if a vision is written with symbolism or literal language, he has it all right there. He laid it all out so that you would understand. We know that if there's symbols in the vision, like a gold head, silver arms, brass belly, iron legs. We know we have to have outside interpretation. I already showed you how the scriptures actually unravel that, and then we have historical facts that confirm it. But literal language is different. It just needs to have the proper application from the secular historical fact, and that's what happens in Daniel chapter 11. You have to go find the secular historical fact that applies to the scriptures, and you have to be sure it's the right one, because there's lots of times there's 3 or 4 different kinds of historical fact, and they'll all fit the verse, so you have to then pick the one that works with the forward progressive movement and the dates. Daniel distinguishes the difference between prophetic terminology and the rule regarding prophetic time. Remember, times, and a dividing of time? That's just prophetic language to mean 1,260. It's not a prophetic rule. It's all you have to remember, but most people don't teach that. They say when you see that, it is always 1,260 years. It is simply not true. It's just prophetic terminology. And you already know this. All timelines begin and end with speaking voices or decrees. And number 8, all timelines have good news and not so good news for all groups of people involved. I think you saw that in chapter 4. You can see that in every timeline in history. Daniel frequently uses repetition. He does it a lot in his book, and he does it for a reason, because he wants to get your attention for important matters. That's why the structure of his book, for his visions, it's repeated in the same structure every time. He wants to get your attention to follow him. If you follow his instructions and his structure in his book, you'll have no problem of knowing what to do with the Daniel 12 timelines. And Daniel wants you to be aware of any sneaky switches. He wants you to remember, always remember, that this vision in chapter 4 is literal, and be on the lookout if anybody's going to tell you anything different. Know that chapter, know what it means, and know that there is no interpreter that comes to Daniel like Gabriel or in a vision. There is nothing like that. This is a completely literal vision. It's so much fun. So this is a wrap-up, and I'm just hoping that all of your timeline studies are going to be abundantly blessed. I hope you had fun learning this, and that's the end for today. But we're going to, in 2 days, we're going to break open some of the timelines in Daniel 7, 8, and 9, and just break them open and find these voices that start them and begin them, and give you an exercise to see what it's all about. So I hope that you come and join us on Tuesday and have fun with that. That will be your practice. And that's it. Just thank you so much for being with us today. That's all she wrote.
May the Ruach bless you on this day. I look forward to it. I do.